actually being aware that, you know, because I never considered morals in anything I've ever done in my life. I don't think my parents ever talked to me about morals. And, you know, to look at, you know, where you are in life based on morals is pretty interesting, actually. Kind of gives you something to base your opinions and facts and judgments and all that.
I have never thought that I could do this. I've barely been clean like 22 months. And I'm getting to the point like I get nervous even though I'm not doing nothing wrong or something like that. And I don't know, I feel like weird, I guess, because I've never been clean in my life this long.
You know, I'm a heroin addict. I'm a drunk. You know, I've led a pretty violent life, and I've been a thief most of my life. And you know, I can return to that. I can decide to return to that, or I can decide to move forward.
In this type of work, I feel that if a person doesn't develop a moral character about them, it doesn't matter everything we tell them. It won't stick. They'll go back to doing what feels good, whatever they want to do. I mean, if that means selling drugs, if that means raping women, if that means beating up your children, it doesn't. You know, everything is okay. And to me, you know, if you have morals, you have a conscience.
For me, it made, those were insights. Also, just in terms of the material, and no matter how many times I hear this, it always brings me back to my family and my significant relationships and how I'm relating at that point.
I learned a lot of stuff, and a lot of my past came up, and it was difficult of hearing all the stuff that I never learned or knew the wrong things that I did was wrong, and it was hard just facing all the stuff I did, and I talked about it, and it was hard, and just believing that that was me, and that I could change, and I believe I have changed.
The changes from like the first time I'd seen it, whereas in the first time I really viewed myself as a real amoral person, really didn't care what other people thought of me or the things that I did, and was real reckless in my life before I came here, as to where now my morals and my values have really changed, and I see life and myself in a different perspective.
When I first came here, I only knew one role, and that was to be a gangbanger and to everyone's out of my program. And here at Amity, they teach you can be a leader or a teacher, or you can be loud, you can be silent, and it was all new to me.
I came here with very little. Had to sell a lot of my car, had to sold to pay debts and that sort of thing, and I really felt like, gosh, I'm here, and I don't really have a whole lot of options. Even though it was a choice that I made to come, there was no out but to go through. And that to me was a lot of conflict.
I think a lot of people out in the world are afraid to say what they think, and not because of, you know, it's going to hurt them. They're afraid of what people are going to think of them. And today I've I think at school right now is the biggest deal for me, because I'm taking a writing class, and I write a lot about my own life, you know, because I think that's helped me, you know, turn around, you know, and become who I am today. And you know, I'm pretty honest about who I am, where I came from, and I think people are like, you know, shocked, or, you know, are like, and it puts me in a position to think, you know, is honest being wrong, or, you know, what's the limit of saying who you really are? And I think I'm doing the right thing, and I think that takes a lot of, you know, moral thought.
This evening we're going to talk about moral development. And Of all the seminars that I've given over the past 20 years, this is probably the one I've given the most. And I've given it the most because I think it makes the most sense in terms of fundamentals of understanding what we're doing and what we're about. There are a lot of ways to look at our work in therapeutic communities, a lot of different perspectives. And in other kinds of programs, provide services for people who have addiction problems. One way to look at this work is to look at it strictly from the point of view as a medical problem, that addiction is a disease, that it has a cause, and to some extent at least can be cured or put in remission, you know, like other diseases like cancer or tooth decay or, you know, a variety of afflictions that are known to man. Accurate diagnosis from this perspective is very important. The development of a prescription that, you know, we give you to do. It can be a behavioral, it can be medicine, or it can be a behavioral prescription. You know, your doctor might say you've got to swim or walk or do something. Effective treatment and proper aftercare ensure the best outcomes. We see this perspective on addiction because there's it's sort of compared with mental illnesses. Mental illnesses, we've developed very potent medications to really, to the extent that many psychiatrists today they really have a new profession, psychopharmacology. They really are more pharmacologists than they are traditional psychiatrists. They spend a great deal of time figuring out what's the matter with somebody and then giving them certain kinds of medication that are going to change and improve those people. This point of view on addiction is reinforced to some extent by the fact that there's a lot of what you call comorbidity. There's a lot of people who are mentally ill who are substance abusers, abuse drugs, alcohol, licit and illicit drugs. And also you have a certain population of people who have substance abuse problems who are mentally ill, have diagnosable mental disorders. So to some extent there's a movement, a perspective on this that sees, well, if a prescriptive approach will work. That's the best way we can approach this, is looking at it as a disease and diagnosing it and treating it. And of course things like methadone is as an antagonist, a narcotic essentially that operates for people who have heroin problems, is a medical kind of approach to a substance abuse problem. And abuse is another way of dealing more or less medically with a substance abuse problem. There's another perspective on this, at least one more, several others probably. That's just to look at addiction as bad behavior. Character disorders, immature personalities, bad boys and bad girls who did not have limits set for them. And what they need is to invoke an ascending order of punishments, sanctions. And when people are affected by these sanctions, they will then change their behavior. Okay? You know, why do people loot? Well, they know the police aren't there, right? So they're going to run around and loot. If they know the police are there, they're not going to loot. So essentially that looks at the substance abuse, breaking the law, acting badly as a problem of behavioral management, and essentially you get harsher and harsher sanctions. When Nye and I went to Malaysia, we were arriving on the planes, wonderful, we were flying business class, the women in their sarongs were serving us Oriental food, and then came on the announcement to the plane, by the way, folks, you should know that the punishment for having drugs in Malaysia is public hanging. And then one of our neighbors told us that there had recently been a public hanging of some foreigners who didn't apparently listen to the stewardess. So that's a pretty harsh penalty. We haven't quite gotten to that point in the United States. But we are spending $25 billion in prison and parole costs in the United States. So we're not counting jails and juvenile halls and so forth and so on. So we're investing pretty heavily in that because 60 to 85% of those people who are incarcerated or on parole are serious substance abusers. So we apparently think as a country that that's a pretty good approach to controlling substance abuse. So far, it hasn't made too much of a difference. A lot of people think that hasn't been a very effective approach. We know that punishment is a notoriously bad learning strategy for children, that you cannot punish people children into good behavior. You either scare them so much that they spend all their time trying to avoid punishment, or they just simply get paralyzed and don't do anything because they're afraid it might be wrong. You do not get the kind of healthy, exciting, spontaneous kind of children who make good learners that way. And there's a lot of evidence you don't get very much learning with adults either. There's another point of view, at least a third one here, which addicts have social deficits. They have problems. And those problems, if they're remedied, they'll stop using drugs. Those include educational deficits. Many of the people who are drug addicts, certainly in our prisons and jails, don't have a high level of educational achievement. There's been theories that people who have learning disorders are very, very prone to becoming addicts. Vocational deficits. Very frequently people can't get a job, so they in despair turn to drugs and crime as a way of fulfilling that deficit. And if trained vocationally, certainly they would stop indulging in this bad behavior. So emotional deficits. People who were raised in abusive homes, dysfunctional neighborhoods and families, where they were taught the wrong values, or where they might have been victims of abuse and violence in their own homes and neighborhoods. And so the sense is once you essentially put a Band-Aid or fix those deficits, then those people will automatically recover. There's a lot of people who think that literacy is really the key to ending addiction. You know, there's such a tremendous correlation between people who are incarcerated and illiteracy that's what we should really focus on, that illiteracy will just solve the whole thing, that literacy training. I want to suggest another approach this evening, or perhaps a way of saying it is another paradigm, another model for looking at what we do. And what we have been doing for many, many, many years in therapeutic communities. I suggest to you that the teaching and therapeutic community is a school for moral development. That is really what it is, if we boil it down. That's what it does best, that's what it does well, and that's what it has been doing. When it functions well, that's exactly what it's up to. I suggest that by making moral development the central focus of therapeutic communities, and of all of you, making it your central focus, will bring our resources to bear on the most important aspect of our work, the one which makes the biggest difference for the greatest number of people. The people who come to us, it's going to give them the best opportunity to develop their human potential and not just be survivors. God, what a terrible thing to be a survivor. It's a terrible word we've entered. You know, well, I'm a survivor. I mean, that's a kind of, boy, what low expectations we have for ourselves. When we bring in moral development, we give people something to really hold on to, something they can keep working on for the rest of their lives. It's not just recovery. It's something that gives them a goal to go as far as their potential and their creativity will take them. So, with that, let me explain what I'm talking about. What do we do as human beings? We grow. We develop. You know, if we had to say, what do? We develop. Rocks don't develop. They may become smaller or larger depending on circumstances or change their composition, but they don't develop. Living things develop. They change over a period of time in some predictable ways. We develop physically. We all know this because none of us were this size when we were 1 year old. So something happened. We grow very rapidly at first. What's the period of the most rapid growth we have? That period of time when we're in the womb. You know, really at the time of fertilization. Have you ever seen those pictures? Wow, the cell division is just like crazy. And we develop literally from a two-celled being to this a little fetus, billions of cells in a very, very short period of time. So that's the period where the growth rate is just almost flat, steep. Then, we grow very rapidly. Then we start to slow down. We have a period of time when we grow at sort of an even rate. Then we have a spurt in adolescence. That was the point when my dad started buying all my clothes 3 sizes too large because I grew 8 inches in 1 year, And for years I had to convince him, Dad, just buy him the right size now. So we grow, and usually by the time we're teenagers, in our late adolescence, we're full grown, pretty much. And we get rounder, and sometimes we get more muscular or less, but essentially our physical growth, for all practical purposes, is done with. That's a normal pattern of development. There are abnormal growth, right? We all know this. There are giants, huge people. There are dwarves and midgets, people whose growth has been stunted somehow or another. And there are children who are born who are huge. There are children born who are very tiny, and so forth and so on. There's a lot of different variations, but there's kind of a general theme to our growth. We also develop cognitively, and we know this, that our mind literally changes. The way we see things, the way we respond to things, the way we process information changes over a period of time. There's been a number of cognitive psychologists. Probably the most famous is Piaget, who set up 7 different stages of intellectual or cognitive growth that a child goes through, starting with sensory motor perception from infancy to 2 years old, to pre-operational, all the way to formal operational in late adolescence. Piaget, incidentally, only 50% ever achieved the fullest potential of formal operational thinking. And we can see this in children. If we ask a child a question, like we say, Ray, and let's say that Ray is 5 years old. We say, Ray, when you see an airplane flying in the sky and you see it getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and he says, yeah. He says, is it really getting smaller? There's a long pause. And then very frequently let's say, yes, the plane is really getting smaller. Well, what's happening to the people inside the plane, Ray? Well, they're shrinking too with the plane. And how are they doing that? Well, their heads are just getting way, way down in their shoulders. And so how does a little kid explain perspective? That as things go off in the distance, they appear to get smaller to us. Well, you come up with some explanation that is credible to yourself, if no one else. And that is a stage of thinking. Now, presumably, if I asked all of you that question, I would get different answers about why it appears to get smaller. We know that if an infant is tracking a ball, and we have a ball in this hand, and it goes behind something, a box or something like that, and the baby is tracking it, at a certain age, for them the ball simply disappears. When they can't see it, it doesn't exist anymore. And when it comes out the other side, they're startled. They'll do one of these startle responses. At a later stage, maybe just a year later or even a few months later, we bring the ball back here and the child tracks it behind the box and expects it to come out on the other side. And if it doesn't, he's startled. He knows that seeing, whether I can see it or not, it still exists. This is a change in stages, cognitive stages of development. Do you see that? At one stage you see it one way, at another you really see it another way. Physical phenomena hasn't changed. In regards to this kind of growth and development, we can say 2 things about it. One, it's sequential. Sequential means one stage after another, which means you always got to start little and get big. You always got to start with a less understanding and grow to greater understanding, to better perception of things, more complex understanding. And it's invariant. You have to start, you have to crawl before you walk to walk before you run. You can't go the other direction. So it's not only in sequence, but the sequence is invariant. Let's talk now about moral development. About the time that therapeutic communities formed, interesting parallel, a Harvard professor by the name of Lawrence Kohlberg began work which was really begun by his mentor, Piaget, on moral development in children. He asked a very important question that's been asked by philosophers since there have been philosophers, and by psychologists in the last 100 years. He asked the question, how does moral thinking and moral action develop in children? Is it like other forms of development? Is it the same in different cultures and in different races and in different classes? Is it the same for boys and for girls? And what is it and how can we describe it? That's a pretty critical question. He discovered over his 35 years of research that there are several levels of moral development. There is the pre-conventional level, which is generally, which we all start with. Everybody starts at zero. Everybody starts at zero. We all start the same, just like we all start as two cells. And that level of pre-conventional thinking is really characterized by a perspective in which I'm the most important thing in the world. Okay? I'm the most important thing in the world, and the world sort of spins around me. Now, generally speaking, children grow out of this stage somewhere around probably 9 to 12 or something like that. Then you have the more conventional perspective, which is really where the bulk of adults are on the planet. The conventional level, which is why we call it conventional, because that's where everybody is. The conventional level is sort of, I'm a member of society, and I'm really thinking about other people a lot. I'm not just thinking about myself. Other people are really important to me now, and they're equally important to my own selfish wants and needs and my own perspective. Thirdly, the post-conventional or principled one is where really principles, underlying ethical principles, have become critically important to the way I view the world. These stages correspond, just like cognitive and physical stages, to typical ages. Probably children have completed level 1 by age 12, level 2 by late adolescent. But there's nothing written in stone that says you got to move up this ladder. If you don't have the right conditions, you may stay at a lower level for your entire life. Okay? There have to be certain things in your environment that push you on these higher levels. There can be physically stunted people, we know, small people. There can be cognitively stunted people because of organic brain damage, because of an environment. Some child's locked in the closet for 10 years, he doesn't learn a language. There can also be morally stunted people. In fact, probably the most common thing in our times is moral dwarfism. People who are really retarded morally. So being at lower levels means that the individual is less concerned with his fellow man and woman. Higher levels mean the person is increasingly sensitive to the world around him or her. We can look at the quality of relationships and make some pretty good guesses about moral level of that person. It's in the relationships. So there's some things to say about the stages. The stages are different. When we look at these, they're qualitatively different. They're not just increased knowledge or an internalization of somebody else's. Something's really happened inside that person. Secondly, they're invariant, just like cognitive and physical growth. They're integrations. A higher stage always understands all the stages below it. Okay, where a lower stage does not understand anything above it. Understand? Okay, the stages are cross-cultural. This has been done throughout the world in different villages, islands in the South Seas, and these stages have been shown to exist. And critical for you. You cannot be a dunce. You cannot be mentally retarded and be a moral genius. Impossible. You have to have at least average intelligence to move up the moral scales. But You can be very, very smart cognitively and not be morally advanced. You can be a moral idiot and be very, very smart. And we've seen examples of that. We've seen some very, very smart people. We saw it recently in the Wall Street scandal. Some very, very bright people who are morally at a very low level, okay? We have seen it occasionally in our political figures who are obviously quite bright. They've gotten through graduate school, but morally the things they're doing are outrageous. So you can have high intellect and low moral development, but you can't have real, real low cognitive ability and have very, very high moral growth. Okay, let's talk about these stages. The pre-moral stages is simply there are no morals. And if you've ever been around a baby, there is no morality. If, they are really the original hippies. If it feels good, do it. I mean, their morality is tasting, touching, sucking, being held. And moving on in the first years of life into the next stage, punishment and obedience orientation. In this stage, what is right is what I've been told is right and what I won't get punished for. So typically in this stage, a child will want a toy from another child and simply go over and take it. And that child may howl for an hour, and the other child playing with his toy, not even hearing the crying while we're going nuts, doesn't really relate to other persons. Really, I'm the center of my universe, and I want this toy, and if I can take it and there's no punishment, it's mine. Moving beyond that, we get to what we'll call instrumental relativist orientation, or instrumental hedonist orientation, a word that you use every day. And essentially, this is sort of what we call a marketplace orientation. I say to you, I'll scratch your back if you scratch my back. So essentially, I'm now conscious that there are other people in the world. And I've realized I've got to kind of make deals with them to get along and get what I want. And I may be doing something that looks altruistic. I may give you this disgusting bucket that I have that I'm really sick of and tell you what a hell of a deal it is, and get your neat fire truck. And you think you've really prospered, and I'm thinking behind, in my cunning mind, this dummy, I can take advantage of him all day long. So there's this sort of marketplace, and literally let the buyer beware. This, of course, now we're starting to get familiar with things that not only do you see in 9-year-old children, but you very frequently see in much older adults. Okay? Certainly you see this, those of you who've been in prisons and jails lived in a world like this, where everything is deal-making and taking advantage of. Not outright. Sometimes the first stage would be just hitting the guy over the head or scaring him half to death and making them give it to you out of fear. The other one is like making deals and doing that sort of thing. Let me give you an example of this. Well, let's take stage 3 first. Stage 3, now we're moving up to a conventional level where I'm living in a world which is populated with other people who I care about. We can call it mutual interpersonal expectations, or simply we can call it good boy, good girl. It's another way of looking at it, because it's that kind of stage in our development when we want to be Boy Scouts, when we want Daddy or Mommy's approval, and we will do almost anything. And good is what makes Daddy happy, or makes the Scoutmaster happy. Okay, what's the problem with this? As we get older, it really means that Daddy might be Hitler. There's problems like this. We had a whole country calling Hitler father and killing Jews. So this stage, we want to do it for somebody else, but we don't have a very good perspective on what that might do, what the social consequences are of that. Let me give you an example. Here's a moral dilemma. Holly likes to climb trees, but when she climbed one day, she fell and broke her arm. Her father said, no, Holly, you can't climb trees any longer. And you must promise me. And she promised her dad not to climb a tree. So one night, just as she's ready to go home, it's getting dark, what happens? Her friend's kitten climbs a tree. Friend can't climb the tree, and the friend appeals to Holly. Holly, will you please climb the tree and get the kitten? Holly's got a problem. She has a moral conflict. To break the promise to her dad or to save the kitten's life, because the kitten's not going to survive the night. What should she do? Stage 1, don't break the promise to dad, he'll spank you. Okay? That's stage 1. Stage 2, saving a kitten's life is pretty important. Okay? It's pretty important. And besides which, my friend, may do something for me. We may get something out of this. Okay? Another view of this, stage 2, a reason not to do it is it's not your kitten, why worry about it? All right? Okay. I'm not going to get anything out of it. Okay, do you see what I mean, that level? Stage 3 is if Holly doesn't help, she'll hurt her friend's feelings. And besides which, her father would understand her breaking her promise under these circumstances. Do you see, we've moved, how that moves? So these are kind of children's answers to this moral dilemma. And they actually use dilemmas like this to find out where kids are at on this. So in stage 3, and again stage 3 is where, stage 3 and 4 where most adults are in our country, we really are looking at normal behavior, being good, okay, being good. And there's a great example George McKenna gives of this is when he was riding a segregated bus in Louisiana going to school, McKenna being the person who turned around that South Central LA high school, George Washington Preparatory. He said, we were all being good riding in the back of the bus, but we weren't right. We were just good. We were conforming to expected behavior that the Negro should sit in the back of the bus, and we all wanted to get downtown, and we were doing the good thing. And he said, we've got to stop being good and start thinking about being right. And very frequently, being right means getting into some conflict, which, of course, the civil rights activists did. Stage 4 is law and order. This is, of course, duty, the maintenance of the social order. This is also one of the things we argue with somebody that convinces them at stage 4. We say, if you do this and everybody did it, think what would happen. And that begins to become a pretty compelling argument. Yeah, I do want to go home and see my wife. And I really don't want to stay here and help with the focus on Saturday and do another open house. And at stage 4, a convincing argument is like, yes, Bill, but what if everybody did that? Think our whole community would go down the drain. Now, if Bill is at stage 3, this isn't convincing. At stage 4, he says, yeah, you're right. I'm doing the wrong thing because the whole community would be affected by my behavior. Give you a couple of clues on some questions asked. Okay. So this is the doing one's duty, maintaining the social order, so forth and so on. Then we move to stage 5, which is, now you got it, when we get to 5, most people don't get to 5 or to 6. Recognize that. Stage 5 is kind of a social contract perspective. It's legalistic, and it is essentially, our Constitution is a level 5 document. We give things to the government, and the government protects us. You know, we elect our officials. We don't assassinate them, okay, when we want change. We have certain forms that we agree on, that we work on. But we also protect the rights of minority. No matter what the majority is, it isn't right to discriminate, okay? So those are we've agreed on that. Now, interesting, difference between 4 and 5, laws can change. There's a way of changing laws, right? In stage 4, people really don't admit. It's a real status quo orientation. Let's keep things the way they are. We don't like change. Okay, it's a maintenance of what is. 5 really recognizes that things can change, but they change in a certain way, a certain legal, procedural way. And when we get to stage 6, who are we talking about? We're really talking about the moral giants of our history. This is where we get Buddha and, you know, Jesus, and in more recent times, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Bishop Tutu, Elie Wiesel, Mother Teresa. We get people who are really our moral role models. They're at a level where, as Lao Tzu said, they treat every being as they're a member of their own body. They really have a sense of the entire world, that they're connected to it, and that, you know, in the famous words of Hemingway, ask not for who the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. Okay? Actually, it's John Donne, but you have to, we recognize these people. Many times we don't understand them. They do things that are amazing to us based on principle. They risk their own lives for principle. They're willing to die for what they believe in, and frequently do. They have internalized the golden rule and really live it every day of their lives. But now, the question is, so now you understand a little bit about moral growth, the stages that we all can go through, and some of them we all do go through. But moral growth doesn't just happen. We have to provide conditions for it to happen. And what are those conditions? What are the conditions? This is a very important question for us. Very important question for us. Probably one of the most important questions we'll ever ask in our lifetimes. What are the conditions that promote moral growth? Because what's the problem in our society? We have a lot of moral retards. I mean, our crime problem is a morality problem. It's a way of saying we've got a lot of level 2 people who just steal unless there's a cop there. And no matter how many cops we hire, we're never going to be able to hire enough to watch every criminal. We all know that. Many of you know it better, better than the police do. Okay? There's no way we can do this on a punishment basis. We have to move people from the lower levels to the higher levels so they don't want to essentially violate their neighbors.
Well, I have never been, since a little kid, a law and order person. I started stealing at a very young age, and I continued stealing until about 5 years ago. And I don't think I've went a year in my life where I didn't steal something from somebody. And in the last 5 years, I have really grown. I haven't stolen anything in 5 years, or have not even wanted to steal anything, because I like the person I am. I don't like that old person. I didn't like that person that did things just because I could get away with them. I like being at that level because I do have a conscience about a lot of things that I haven't had a conscience about before.
The conditions for moral growth are conflict, emotional conflict, intellectual conflict, where we begin to realize that the way we're living can be improved.
The conflict is being a preacher's kid hooking on the street, down the street from her dad's church. And being okay with it. But at the same time, not being okay with it. You know, part of me was like, well, I've got to support my habit, and this is a way to make money, and I'm self-employed. That's how I rationalized it. But the other part of me is like, this is not a good thing. You have a daughter at home. You're right down the street from your dad's church. There could be parishioner driving by. You're turning into a scummy dope fiend. And that was a big conflict for me. What happened was I would feel guilty, but I was too guilty to go home. So I used more dope, so I didn't have to feel it. So I just stayed there. It was like a continuous cycle over and over and over again. I just didn't stop. And what brought me out of it was this guy on the street. And he just basically told me, he says, you don't belong here. The first question he asked me was, do you have any children? I said, yeah. And he immediately got mad at me. He says, let me see the pictures. And I had pictures of my kids on me. And he says, I don't want you in my world anymore. And I'm like, what are you talking about? He says, I don't like people, and I'm starting to like you. You need to get out of my world, or I'm going to make your world hell. And I got scared because he meant it. The man liked me as a friend, but he liked me enough to just tell me, get the hell out. And I would say he's one of the reasons I'm here. So that's it in a nutshell.
Me being in conflict would be holding other people accountable, putting my nose in other people's business. It's easy for me to just, if I see somebody doing something, mind my own business. And to go outside of that, which you have to do around here, you have to pull people up and, you have to stick your nose in other people's business, so that puts me in conflict a lot of times.
I had to speak about my family. My mom, when I first got here, my mom had just went to prison, and I was afraid if I said my mom is in prison and I was 15 years old that they wouldn't let me go home. And it was the whole thing of me being afraid of authority, that, Department of Corrections was going to put me back in jail, and I didn't want to have that. I didn't want to feel like I had bad family, or, I didn't want to tell the truth about my family, because I was always said, told, don't, speak about what happens in the house. What happens in the family happens in the family, and nobody else has to know about it. And I had, over the years, I still have, things come up, and I struggle with it sometimes, because I think that it's nobody's business, but for me, I know it's always going to come around. But that's been the biggest conflict.
I came here speaking in the language of the gang. I was in the Bloods, and in that particular set, C's were not allowed to be used in your conversation. I was in conflict with my language. How am I going to change it? I've been using it since I was 12, and I was 18 when I got here, and I was like very much into doing my own thing, just coming here because court sent me here and leaving and going back to what I was doing. I didn't know I was going to have to go through so much change. But I'm still here, so I guess that means to me that I do want to change, and I'm not giving up on myself, and people are not giving up on me here.
Know that the level we're at is not the best level. Secondly, having somebody to teach us one level above. The preacher wants to preach to you from level 5 or 6, but you need to hear it if you're at level 1 from somebody who's at level 2. And that's why what we do is great, because we have all these people at all these different levels, and everybody's teaching in groups, in retreats, in morning meetings, right? That's what we do. That's why the therapeutic community works. Many roles to play, and we got that, don't we? All kinds of different roles.
Growing up, I didn't have a peer group. My family moved about 9 times in 5 years, and I never had the opportunity to have a peer group. And if I did have a peer group, I never took the opportunity to hold anybody accountable. I was kind of like the guy that had the bag, and if I felt like sharing it with you, I would do that. My role in this community now is a boundary holder, and I hold boundaries with people very, very firmly. And I think the person I'm doing it for the most is myself, because I am not about to do something I just ask somebody else not to do or suggest it to somebody else not to do. My role in this community is basically, I'm a father figure, and I enjoy it. I enjoy when the guys call me dad. Like, I talk to my children about morals. I don't think my parents ever mentioned to me anything about morals or how I should live morally, because my father, my parents, most of my mother, but my mother was a very religious woman. My father was, he was a lot like me. My father was in prison for about 5 years, and the things that led up to him being there, I saw. Only thing is, I wanted to be just like him, but I didn't want to get caught. Being in this process for the last 5 years have taught me that some of the things I've learned as a child have been devastating for me as an adult, and I need to do something about it now.
When you're a prisoner, all you can be is a bad guy. All you can be is a prisoner. You can never move across to a different level. You can never become one of them. But in the therapeutic community, what happens all the time? The newest guy on the bench is running the service crew, running the kitchen. Soon, getting positions of responsibility.
Where I first changed roles was in group. My first role was like just opening up, letting people know me, and that was hard in itself. And I found it to be like real hard, very hard, especially coming from the place that I came from, Los Angeles. All I knew was gang life, and I didn't know how to talk in front of people. I never, you know what I'm saying? You meet them on the streets, you rob them, or they run away from you or whatever. That's all I knew. And here I had the opportunity. I wasn't forced. I had the opportunity to like change my role, and that was like real new to me. And it was interesting. I found it real interesting to open up and let people know about me. I also thought that they would run away from me or be scared or whatever, but they kept coming with the questions.
The fourth thing that is needed is sustained responsibility for another human being. And this, of course, big brothers and big sisters, take care of somebody, immediately you're expected to do that. Groups are great conflict-arousing situations where there's an enormous amount of teaching going on all the time. Probably the most important aspect of this is a warm, accepting family and community. That's absolutely essential for moral growth. A demand for people to take responsibility. Teachers who teach and don't preach, and teach from their heart and with examples from their own lives, rather than standing up and lecturing. And who use the practical business of living as the classroom for teaching. An environment where many, many roles previously unavailable are there for you to step into.
Knowing that I never want to be the person that I was, and how I was destroying myself, and the sadness that I felt for myself, and just never really wanted to be that person anymore. See, like I said, I see life in a whole different perspective now. And I care a lot more about myself than I did in the past. In the past, I was out for number one, and I really didn't care who got hurt behind what I did, And now I'm real conscious of that. It's hard to believe the person that I was as compared to the person I am now, and that whole sense of my morals changing. Some parts of it's real scary. It's really hard, and to accept myself as I am now, and I know it's so easy to be the person I was, and to show how I achieved some of the goals and some of the morals and values that have been instilled in me through this place, and how good it feels, and to let people know that there's hope. That there's people out there who are just like us, that really care, and that, I don't know, it's a great thing that I came here, man, because I know if I would have stayed out there, I would have just continued to hurt people, hurt myself, and never really achieve anything in my life. I was just existing, I had no purpose.
I want to grow as far as a human being. I've always just been the type of person that takes, type of person that doesn't feel good about himself, and type of person that is probably a danger to society, and I want to aspire to something a little greater than that. I've seen some good role models here in Amity, and these are people I want to be like someday. I admire the qualities in a lot of people around here. And I want to get to that stage myself, you know, because I want to feel good about myself. I want to be a contributor to this life, this short little life we're in. And so far, I've been a taker, you know. And all I can say is that seeing it laid out the way Rod's presentation was, it gives you something to shoot for. And he told us about the tools that you need to use, you know, which is the conflict thing, keeping us in conflict. That makes it easier to accept the conflict if you know that there's a good, valid reason for it. The idea about helping other people, you know, because I've always wanted to care for other people, but I've never put it into practice. And so here we do put it into practice by having a little brother or just caring about people when you see they need your help, you know. And I do feel good when I do things like that.
Our society is suffering from millions of people who are not developing their moral potential. On higher moral levels, you don't use drugs anymore because using drugs is only consistent with selfishness and lower moral levels. We don't use drugs anymore on higher moral levels, not because they don't feel great, but because they're inconsistent with our concern with other human beings, which we tap into as soon as we get to those higher moral levels. This argument makes 30-day treatment seem ridiculous. This is an agricultural process, not an industrial process. This is the process of human development and growth. It takes time, and it takes nurturing conditions, human conditions, to make it happen. But when it happens, something happens to human beings that makes it impossible for them to go back and be selfish and destructive. And that's really what we're all about. And that's what you're really all about. Those are the roles you have to step into. Those are the roles you have to play. That is the teaching that you must do to make this place effective and to change your life. Because in this place, the changers are constantly being changed. All of us who are teachers are constantly being demanded to move to higher moral roles and develop greater morality ourselves. Thank you.
I know for me, what threw me into conflict was having, developed morals at one time and then going into an immoral world or an amoral world, the drug world. I was always flipping back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And I had to do more dope in order just to shut down what little conscience I had. And pretty soon that didn't work.
I'm starting to, at this stage of my life, appreciate some of the finer qualities that my parents possessed, and instead of resisting those, my dad's a good person, and I've always rejected the notion of being a good person as being a weak person. Well, I'm starting to embrace that a little bit, and it's scary. Scary proposition.